Even in the darkest confines of an ancient Egyptian prison, Joseph clung to the memories of his father Jacob, whispering his name as a beacon of his heritage. A sharp transition saw Joseph rise to power as viceroy, overseeing Egypt's prosperity with authority, his royal attire reflecting his immense influence. Yet, in the quiet of his home, Joseph, in Hebrew clothing, taught his sons the traditions of Jacob, preserving his faith under the watchful gaze of the
Shalom, shalom. Thank you for being with us again on La Mishna TV. After watching this introductory video to our class today, let me begin with a scene that, at first glance, seems like a calendar coincidence, but is actually a spiritual provocation. In the Jewish liturgical calendar, Parashat Miketz usually falls exactly on Shabbat Hanukkah. And when Judaism brings texts together, it's not being practical, it's being pedagogical, or uncomfortably profound. Today, I want to raise a conflict that we won't resolve immediately. A conflict that will accompany us throughout this study. The tension between darkness and light. Not as a poetic metaphor, but as a real human experience. Miketz tells us the story of Joseph's rise, a forgotten Hebrew youth, locked in an Egyptian dungeon, invisible to the world, who suddenly emerges into the light of power, of government, of history. Not through rebellion, not through force, not through control, but through interpretation, through wisdom, through something he himself clearly calls the action of God. And in parallel, Hanukkah tells us another seemingly different story, that of the Hasmoneans, weak against an empire, few against many, impure against a dominant culture. And yet, that weakness becomes restoration. The temple is relit. The menorah shines again. The rabbinic tradition insists on reading these two narratives together, not because they are beautiful, but because they contradict and illuminate each other. Joseph rises within the Egyptian system. The Hasmoneans rebel against the Hellenistic system. One integrates, the others resist. So what do we do with that? To complicate matters even further, the Haftarah for Shabbat Hanukkah presents us with the vision of the menorah in Zechariah, accompanied by a phrase that should deeply unsettle us. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit. That is, salvation does not come through absolute human control, but through hashgachah, through providence. And here the unresolved tension appears. If everything depends on providence, what place does human action have? And if everything depends on human action, what sense does it make to speak of providence? This is not a simple message. It's not a children's story of light conquering darkness. It's a warning. Light can be born in a prison. Darkness can hide in power. And discerning between the two requires more than religious fervor. It requires thought, humility, and responsibility. At La Mishna TV, we don't aim to simplify the complex, but to accompany you in thinking about it honestly. I, Abel Flores, will be personally answering your questions and comments, because the real question isn't where the light is, but whether we are willing to see it when it appears in ways we don't control. Let me begin with a single word, a short word, almost inconspicuous, yet loaded with spiritual dynamite. The word is miketz. In Hebrew, miketz, which we usually translate as at the end, at the conclusion. But biblical Hebrew is never innocent, and this word speaks not only of time, it speaks of decree. The Midrashim dwell on its root, ketz, end, and they connect it to a disturbing verse from the book of Job. Ketz sam lahoshech. Ketz sam lahoshech. He set an end to the darkness. It doesn't say that the darkness dissipates on its own. It doesn't say that the light appears by accident. It says that an end is set, determined, delimited. And that reading applies directly to Joseph, to his story, to his imprisonment, to that long, silent, unjust night in which nothing seems to change. Joseph doesn't leave the dungeon when his spirits improve, nor when he learns a moral lesson, nor when someone finally takes pity on him. He leaves when his ketz arrives, when the end decreed by heaven is activated. That changes everything, because then the question is no longer how long the darkness lasted, but why it lasted as long as it did. And the biblical answer is uncomfortable. It lasted exactly as long as it had to. This is the symbolic core of Miketz. We are not dealing with a story of personal triumph. We are dealing with a theology of time. The message is not everything gets better, but something far more demanding. Darkness has a limit, even if we don't know it. And this is where Miketz intersects, almost without permission, with Hanukkah. Because Hanukkah doesn't celebrate that the light suddenly appeared, but that it was deliberately kindled, with insufficient oil, with risk, with discipline. The light of Hanukkah is not naive optimism. It is obedience to a commandment even when the conditions are unfavorable. That's why we can speak of the central value of Hanukkah within Miketz as disciplined hope, not an emotional hope, but a profound conviction. The end will come when heaven decrees it. And in the meantime, we keep moving forward. We keep lighting the candles. We keep being faithful. Joseph didn't know when his night would end. He had no prophetic calendar. He had no guarantees. But he continued interpreting dreams honestly, even when it wasn't in his best interest. He remained Joseph in the darkness. And that didn't shorten the exile, but it made it meaningful. Here lies an essential idea that we often miss. The light isn't always visible, but the end is already determined. And that changes how we experience the night. It doesn't eliminate it. It doesn't beautify it. But it gives it a framework, a limit, a meaning. Hanukkah takes this same idea and translates it into concrete action. We don't passively wait for dawn. We light a candle, even knowing it's small. Not because it will conquer the darkness on its own, but because it is our ethical response while the end has not yet arrived. And this is where everything becomes personal. Because if Yosef emerged from prison with his identity intact, it wasn't because the system had changed, but because he had already decided who he was before he was free. Hanukkah whispers the exact same message to us. Collective redemption doesn't begin when the oppressor falls, but when someone in the darkness refuses to let their inner light be extinguished. Between the pit and the palace, between the night and the menorah, there is a single turning point, the moment when identity ceases to depend on circumstances. And that is the question we cannot avoid. If the doors were to open today, would we emerge as the same people, or merely a functional version of what the system needed us to be? Now, let me return to the exact point where the story seems suspended in midair. Miketz begins where Vayeshev ended: forgetfulness, imprisonment, powerlessness. Joseph is still in prison. The text doesn't soften the scene. There is no spiritual comfort, no visible signs of redemption. There is silence. And silence in the Torah is never accidental. And suddenly, without emotional transition, the most radical turning point of the narrative occurs. Joseph is pulled from the pit and elevated to the second highest position in the Egyptian empire. He doesn't go through intermediate steps. There is no gradual rehabilitation. From the dungeon to the palace, from absolute humiliation to absolute delegated power. It's such an abrupt transformation that it forces us to ask, what is the Torah really narrating here? Because this is not just a story of personal success. This is a gula, a redemption. And in biblical language, individual redemption is almost never merely individual. It's a mold, a pattern, a dress rehearsal for larger historical processes. Tradition has always read this transition as a classic analogy to Hanukkah. Joseph moves from subjugation to responsibility, from imprisonment to leadership. Israel, centuries later, moves from cultural and political subjugation to the Hellenistic Empire, to the reaffirmation of its identity and its service in the Mikdash temple. It's not just about defeating the external enemy, it's about recovering one's own voice. And here a crucial detail appears that is often overlooked. Joseph rises within the Egyptian system. He doesn't flee from it. He doesn't destroy it. He manages it. He learns its language, understands its logic, and governs efficiently. But there is something he doesn't compromise: his identity. Joseph doesn't become Egyptian to fit in. That's the subtle point of the text. The true miracle isn't that he gets out of prison, but that he gets out as Joseph, with power, but without assimilation, with authority, but without inner betrayal. He operates within the system without surrendering his essence. And that is precisely what Hanukkah brings to the forefront. The challenge wasn't only military, it was cultural. Hellenism offered integration, prestige, beauty, and rationality. The price was subtle, the dilution of difference. To be like everyone else. The Hasmoneans understood that losing the temple was not just losing a building. It was losing a center of identity. That is why the value of Hanukkah, as understood from the portion of Miketz, is so demanding. Dignity and fidelity to identity under pressure. Not an aggressive or isolated identity, but a firm one. Joseph does not preach from prison, nor rebel from a position of power. He serves, he administers, he feeds entire nations, but he does not dissolve into the system. This is unsettling because it shatters two very modern illusions. The first, that to be faithful, one must leave the system. Joseph demonstrates that this is not always the case. The second, that to survive, one must adapt to the point of disappearing. Joseph demonstrates that this is not true either. The Torah, with brutal elegance, is telling us that redemption does not always consist of changing the external world. Sometimes it consists of navigating through it without losing one's inner self. And that transforms a personal story into a national model. I want you to notice something crucial. Joseph didn't survive because he had a brilliant moment, but because he knew how to accumulate resources wisely. Hanukkah says the same thing, but in halakhic language. Mosif v'holesh, one light is added, then another and another. Darkness is not countered with a single heroic flash, but with intelligent persistence. Joseph doesn't improvise in the face of famine. He builds year after year while there is still abundance. The menorah doesn't suddenly burst into light either. It grows night after night. And here is the tension we cannot ignore. If the light is sustained only when more is added, what happens when we stop adding to it? There is a halakha, Jewish law, regarding Hanukkah that we usually observe almost automatically, without stopping to consider how radical its message is. Beit Hillel establishes that a fixed light is not maintained. On the first night, one candle is lit, and each night another is added. Mosif v'holej. It is added. It is always added. Holiness, according to this logic, is not preserved by repetition, but by growth. And this is crucial, because the halakha could have said the opposite. It could have mandated a constant, stable, sufficient light. But no, it demands increase. It demands movement. It demands daily responsibility. If I light the same amount today as yesterday, it is no longer faithfulness. It is stagnation. Now, when we read Miketz through this lens, something becomes evident. Miketz is a Parashah, Torah portion, about proper accumulation. Joseph doesn't improvise. He doesn't wait for the crisis to arrive to react in panic. He designs a patient, rational, sustained strategy. Year after year, during the years of abundance, he saves, organizes, and plans, not to shine, but to withstand the darkness he knows will come. That is the profound parallel with Hanukkah. The menorah is not lit when the danger is already overwhelming. It is built when there is still a possibility to do so. Joseph doesn't save Egypt with a last-minute heroic gesture, but with a constant discipline that seems boring until it becomes vital. Modern homiletic interpretation states it clearly. The act of adding light is the Jewish response to darkness, not denying it, not dramatizing it, responding to it with strategy. Exactly as Joseph responds to danger. Not with improvisation, but with sustained growth. And here an uncomfortable lesson emerges for our contemporary spirituality. We live expecting bursts of meaning, moments of inspiration, great awakenings. But Hanukkah and Miketz tell us something much less romantic and much more demanding. Redemption is usually built with small acts, repeated faithfully. That is why the central value of Hanukkah, read through the lens of Miketz, is constancy. The light doesn't always dazzle. Sometimes it is barely noticeable. Sometimes it seems insufficient. But if you add to it, the entire scenario changes. One more light today doesn't impress. 7 nights later, it transforms the space. Joseph understood this before he had power. He didn't accumulate for himself, but for a future that hadn't yet brought suffering. The menorah teaches the same lesson. It is lit even when the night doesn't seem so dark. Because wisdom doesn't act only in times of crisis. It prepares beforehand. During this short break in the middle of the class, we want to let you know that if you would like to make a donation, you can do so by scanning the QR code you see on the screen, or by clicking the link below in the description. I personally thank you very much for your contribution. Until now, we've seen perseverance, strategy, and accumulation. But here, a disturbing crack appears. Joseph not only manages the future, he reads it before it happens. And he doesn't do it with magic, but by deciphering hidden patterns within the chaos. Because when power dreams and doesn't understand, history becomes disordered. And it is there that the Torah offers us a provocative promise. The numbers are not random, the cycles are not capricious, and the weakness that overcomes strength is not an accident. What Pharaoh sees as a nightmare, tradition will interpret as design, and what seems like chaos is about to be revealed as structure. Now let's enter uncomfortable territory, because here the Torah stops talking about human strategy and begins to speak of divine structure. Pharaoh dreams, and this is no minor detail. In the Bible, when power dreams and doesn't understand its own dream, something is profoundly out of alignment. The content of the dream is familiar, but not trivial. 7 robust cows, 7 full ears of grain, followed by 7 lean cows and 7 withered ears. Years of abundance. Years of famine. But the Torah insists, almost obsessively, on a number, 7. And here tradition raises an eyebrow, because 7 is not just any number. It is the biblical number of the complete cycle. 7 days of the week, 7 days leading to Shabbat, 7 as the rhythm of nature and of sanctified time. Therefore, when a text insists on 7 units, the Midrash makes an almost automatic association. The 7 refers to the menorah of the Mikdash, the one with 7 branches, not the 8-branched menorah, which belongs specifically to Hanukkah. And this is key, because the most powerful aspect here is not the arithmetic, but the message. The menorah of the temple represents order, direction, spiritual guidance. Its light is not decorative, it is structural. It indicates how life should flow when it is aligned with the divine. So when Miketz insists on cycles of 7, the Torah is not only talking about agricultural economics. It is suggesting that even history, with its abundance and its famine, responds to an order, not to chance, not to whim, to a design. Pharaoh sees chaos. Joseph sees structure. That is the whole difference. But the dream has another, even more disturbing detail. In both cases, the weak devour the strong. The lean cows eat the robust ones. The dry ears consume the full ones. That is unnatural. The world doesn't work that way. And precisely for that reason, the dream is unsettling. Because the unnatural in the Bible is usually a sign. Many preachers emphasize this point, and rightly so. In the context of Hanukkah, the reason is immediately clear. The small defeats the large. The Maccabees against a disproportionately superior empire. The weak against all logic prevail, not by force, not by numbers, but because the cause is just and divine intervention is at hand. Here, Hanukkah does not appear as a later festival grafted onto the text, but as a pattern that was already there. Pharaoh's dream anticipates a historical logic that will be repeated again and again. When the cause is just, disproportionate odds are not an insurmountable obstacle, and this completely redefines the notion of courage. The courage of Hanukkah in Miketz is not the recklessness of the strong, but the bravery of the minority. The ability to act even when the numbers, the probabilities, and appearances are against you. Trusting that history is not random, but guided. Joseph understands something that Pharaoh cannot see, that the cycles not only describe what will happen, but also how one must position oneself in relation to it. The menorah illuminates space. The dream illuminates time. Both reveal direction. Until now, we have seen structure where others see chaos, cycles where power perceives only threat. But Joseph goes a step further and says something decisive. It is one single dream. Two different images, one and the same message. That is clarity in the face of confusion. Hanukkah does exactly the same in the cultural sphere. The environment multiplies symbols, ideas, and pressures, but the essence is non-negotiable. Faith, practice, and identity are not fragmented. Two scenes, one principle. Because reality has meaning, and that meaning demands truth. And then the inevitable question arises. When that meaning is lost, what is the first thing we cease to understand? History or ourselves? There's a moment in the story that often goes unnoticed, but it's key to understanding everything else. Joseph hears two different dreams, with different images, with symbols that could confuse anyone. And he says something decisive. It is one dream, not two. One. The same idea repeated. That sentence is a declaration of principles. Joseph isn't simplifying the problem. He's asserting that reality, even when presented in fragments, has coherence. That behind the multiple forms there is a single message, and that the interpreter's job is not to multiply explanations, but to unify the meaning. This is profoundly countercultural, because confusion is always presented as diversity, and clarity often seems like rigidity. But Joseph understands that when the message is true, it can be expressed in more than one way without losing its essence. Hanukkah works in exactly the same way. The Hellenistic world didn't impose a single idea. It imposed many aesthetics, many philosophies, many narratives. The temptation wasn't to deny God, but to dilute him, not to prohibit the practice, but to relativize it. And in the face of that cultural noise, Hanukkah responds with a clear decision. The essence is non-negotiable. Faith, practice, and identity are not fragmented. That's why the central value of Hanukkah, as seen through the lens of Miketz, is coherence. Two different scenes, one single principle. Two dreams, one message. Two cultural pressures, one identity. Reality has meaning. It is not chaotic. It is not arbitrary. But that meaning requires truth, and truth requires commitment. And here appears the tension that we cannot quickly resolve, because losing that understanding doesn't usually happen all at once. It happens when we accept partial versions, convenient interpretations, fragmented truths that no longer communicate with each other. And here a decisive turning point occurs. When reality demands a true interpretation, not all interpreters are up to the task. Pharaoh summons his wise men, the experts of the system, those who master the techniques, and none of them manage to bring peace, because there is a point where knowledge without humility becomes mere noise. Joseph, on the other hand, does not presume to know. He declares his dependence on a higher power, and there the conflict that runs through Miketz and Hanukkah unfolds. Is reality controlled from a position of power, or is it understood from above? The question remains open because it is still relevant today. Who is interpreting reality now? There's a moment in Miketz that is profoundly unsettling for any system of power. Pharaoh does what every ruler does when things go wrong. He calls in his experts, his wise men, the empire's technicians, those who are supposed to possess all the knowledge. And yet, none of them can satisfy him. Not because they are ignorant, but because the problem isn't technical. And then Joseph appears, a Hebrew slave recently released from prison, who utters a revolutionary phrase. Biladai Elohim yaneh et shlom paro. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Genesis 41:16. Joseph doesn't present himself as a genius. He presents himself as a conduit. He doesn't offer control. He offers dependence. Herein lies the central clash between Miketz and Hanukkah. The conflict with Hellenism wasn't merely military. It was epistemological and spiritual. The arrogance of believing that everything can be mastered through reason, technology, and power. That if the method is correct, reality will comply. Miketz dramatizes the opposite. The imperial system cannot decipher what truly matters, and the one who can is not the most educated, nor the most integrated, nor the most powerful. It is the one who recognizes a higher source, the one who understands that there are truths that are not conquered but received, that there is a peace that is not manufactured but heard. This is the profound value of Hanukkah, viewed through the lens of Miketz. Intellectual humility and dependence on the divine, not anti-intellectualism, not contempt for knowledge, but an awareness of its limitations. The light of the menorah does not originate from human pride, but from a flame that is accepted, not controlled. We arrive at the conclusion, and it is not a triumphalist conclusion, but a profoundly realistic one. The Haftarah for Shabbat Hanukkah places us before the menorah and reminds us of a phrase that runs through this entire story like a backbone. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit. This is not pious consolation, it is an interpretation of history. That same pattern runs through Miketz from beginning to end. Joseph does not come to power through lineage, nor through propaganda, nor through political charisma. He arrives through a precise and almost invisible chain of events. The prison, the forgetful cupbearer, the disturbing dream, the exact moment, the correct interpretation, and the responsible proposal. Nothing is superfluous. Nothing is rushed. History advances through invisible mechanisms as much as through human decisions. And when the miracle occurs, Joseph does not privatize it. Here, a profound ethical echo with Hanukkah emerges. There is the principle of Pirsumei Nisa, publicizing the miracle, not hiding it. If this journey resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to La Mishna TV, like and share this content, and watch the next video. You can also access the free Mishna course playlist and visit lamishna.com. I, Abel Flores, invite you to leave your questions and comments. I will be responding personally, because the light doesn't end here. It begins here.